Hi, and thank you for tuning in to Noir Histoire. I'm Natasha, and in this episode, I'll be discussing When No One Is Watching. When No One Is Watching by Alyssa Cole is a thriller and romance that makes for an entertaining and somewhat lighter summertime read. The book centers on Sydney, a young black woman who decides to create a history tour to tell the story of her rapidly gentrifying Brooklyn, New York neighborhood. She teams up with her new neighbor, Theo, a young white man who volunteers as her research assistant. While the two work together to gather research, they notice longtime neighbors are disappearing and their properties are being taken over by newcomers. A troubling series of events leads to Sydney and other neighbors feeling unsafe and questioning their own sanity. This is another one of those books that I read the synopsis for, decided to read, and then had second thoughts about reading it pretty early on. And I actually went back and forth with this book. It's decent, and there are things that I like about it, but there's also things that contributed towards it not being a perfect book for me, or rather took away from the book for me. So basically what you have here is a character by the name of Sydney who's living in Brooklyn, New York in a brownstone that was originally owned by her mom. Her mom is now ill and living in what sounds like maybe not a hospital, but some kind of like care facility. And so Sydney is living in this neighborhood where she pretty much grew up and has become a part of the community as a result of her and her mom living here for quite some time. They've gotten to know their neighbors. She knows the area very well. She knows the people on her block, the owner of the corner store. This is home for her. And this is after having moved away for a period of time to, I believe it was Seattle, as she was married, but then ended up getting divorced. And so during that time, she was living in another city, but she's now moved back to Brooklyn and is living back in her childhood home. Her best friend, Drea, also lives there. The two of them grew up together. And so it's like pretty much because brownstones are quite large and people have smaller families now, it sounds like there are 3 units inside. Sydney has one, her mom had one, Drea had the other. And so beyond that, we're then introduced to some of the characters from around the neighborhood. Granted, they'd pop up every now and again along the way, but they kind of ran together for me. I couldn't really keep them straight because they would just like show up momentarily and then drop back out. Pretty much from about the ages of 4 or 5 to about the age of 12, I lived along Flatbush, different parts of it, which is like a big boulevard or avenue in Brooklyn, different apartments along Flatbush. And so because the city is so big and dense, it's like even moving just 10 minutes away, it might put you into a different school district. You'd be in a different neighborhood. It could end up being where people that you saw every day, just moving 10 minutes away, which is maybe 20 city blocks or something like that, moving that distance away, you might not see these people ever again in your life unless you made the effort to go back to your block, to pass back through the neighborhood. Where Sydney and her mom and many of the other residents, they live in houses. They've lived in this community for decades by the point the book takes place. Some have raised their children. They've spent a good portion of their lives in this neighborhood. And so with that, it's different. I'm not saying one is good or bad, living in houses versus apartments. It's just that it's different, right? People kind of stay put for a longer amount of time in houses. So for example, my grandfather, my uncles, and some of my cousins live out in Queens. I lived out in Queens for a few years in the same neighborhood in Queens Village when I was in high school. And so those people who lived in houses, not to say they never move away, but for the most part, you live in houses for longer amounts of time. Children get to know each other. You grow up with the neighborhood kids. You get to know each other very well. Families get to know each other very well. Not to say that you can't build relationships living in apartments, but with apartments, a lot of times, you have some people that remain in apartments for decades, but there's comparatively more movement with apartments versus with people that live in houses. And so with that, the sense of community is a bit different, right? So here it is that you have Sydney living in this neighborhood where she's lived pretty much her entire life. She's grown up knowing the adults around her. They've known her since she was a child. They know her mother. They can tell her stories about her mom that she didn't even know. And so there's a very strong sense of community. Granted, this is like a fictionalized version of Brooklyn. Some of the gist of the neighborhood is similar to what you would have in Brooklyn, but the reality is that it kind of draws on Brooklyn and other neighborhoods with regards to gentrification, where there's quite a bit of Black people and like people of color living in Sydney's neighborhood, or at least historically that had been the case. And basically what you now have is the neighborhood is changing as as typically young, but some of them older, white couples are now moving into the neighborhood. To put things in perspective, I feel like it might be, having moved to Atlanta, I feel that things are a little bit different, where you might have had segregation in the South, where there were these very hardcore lines about where stores and other facilities, resources and whatnot, Black people were allowed to use versus what was made available for white people. But in moving to Atlanta, one of the things that stood out to me, and this might not necessarily be the case throughout the rest of the South, is that within the city and its immediate outskirts, when you travel around, there's very few places I've been to where I haven't seen Black people. Maybe not in plentiful numbers, but at least one or two, you know? And it's like, as a kid, especially growing up in New York, neighborhoods had very distinct boundaries. It's like you had the Russians and Eastern Europeans out in like the Coney Island and Brighton Beach area. You had other areas that were predominantly Jewish. Along Flatbush and Crown Heights area, you had a lot of West Indians. Brownsville and neighborhoods like that were predominantly Black when I was growing up and still are, but they were Jewish in the past. You had neighborhoods like Harlem, right? So Spanish Harlem. The Lower East Side were largely Hispanic. The Lower East Side in the past had been predominantly Jewish, Italian, Irish. Even within Harlem, you have parts of Harlem that were like Italian, Spanish, and then like the Black part. But then it's like, within a lot of these neighborhoods, you're having gentrification, especially in like recent decades, where those distinct boundaries that once existed either no longer exist or they've blurred, right? Like pockets, entire communities, right, that were previously, let's say, ethnically diverse, be that Black, Hispanic, or whatever ethnic group, are now just predominantly white, or you have at least a larger presence of white people than you did in the past. Housing, especially in New York, is very expensive. And so people move to places that are affordable. You can't fault anyone for that. But what's more, the issue is people moving into these neighborhoods. And number one, when you have people who, let's say their paychecks might not be sufficient to buy a place in Manhattan or to afford rent in Manhattan, but in Brooklyn, they're not millionaires. They're like, let's say, thousandaires. So they can move to Brooklyn and easily buy houses there or more easily afford the rents there because their pockets are deeper. They can drive up the housing prices there. It changes the dynamics in these neighborhoods as far as affordability. And part of that, right, gentrification is not just about, the purchasing of real estate and driving up the prices, but also how neighborhoods change. Because quite often what happens is that the businesses in these neighborhoods change as the needs and interests, preferences of the community changes. So it's like you'll start to see more chains versus, say, smaller mom and pop local places. This is where you start to see like the Starbucks popping up, other like chain coffee shops. And so those places can sometimes drive out like the little local places serving the ethnic community, because as the community changes, the stores then become more mainstream. Rents go up for stores as well. And so it's like, especially when you have when you have people who are coming and purchasing homes or properties at higher prices, it drives up the real estate prices. And in addition to that, the culture of the community changes as well, because the people within the community change the things that they want, they desire changes, right? That's part of this thing with gentrification at the root of it as well. Or really the issue with this as well is that historically with a lot of Black, or let's say minority or ethnic communities, they were largely underfunded and underserved. So you would have like the tax bases would be different, number one. The ability to get loans, home valuations and things like that within neighborhoods historically have been lower in these types of neighborhoods, which meant that it was more difficult for people to get loans, to get mortgages. It was difficult for people to get mortgages to purchase homes. It was then also difficult for people to get loans to renovate or to improve their homes or their properties. Unless you had the money to fund these kinds of things out of pocket, it resulted in a lot of cases in communities and people being forced to choose to rent rather than actually purchase the properties they were living. Through redlining and these other practices, you would have it where certain neighborhoods would kind of be singled out for what's regarded as benign neglect, right? That these neighborhoods, the needs of these neighborhoods, the interests of these neighborhoods, the improvements that would need to be made would be left undone. The neighborhoods would largely just be ignored. The resources that would be poured into, let's say, more well-to-do or more desirable neighborhoods comparable resources would not be made available to these ethnic neighborhoods. And at the root of it was that not that there was any real basis, or one neighborhood had any particular features or topography or things of that nature that rendered it more worthy or unworthy of investment. Quite often the determining factor was who was living there. The discrimination was based on the residents of the area. And so what would then happen is that it wasn't so much the community or the real estate itself was undesirable, rather the people living in the neighborhood were deemed undesirable. Where you had predominantly Black or whatever other ethnic group that was deemed undesirable, investments wouldn't be made into those communities. You would have difficulty getting loans. But then as more desirable residents moved into the area, red white people, suddenly it's easier to get mortgages. There's more investment into properties. You have banks and other businesses along those lines that are willing to pour money into these communities. More businesses are opening up. The government is willing to invest more resources into these communities. And then it's like suddenly you have, let's say, a more effective and efficient police presence within these communities. Problems that could not be resolved or addressed, solutions that could not be found when there were Black people living in these communities. Suddenly, when the demographics change, these problems are no longer unsolvable. What you come to realize is that really the issue here is that some people in the communities that they form are deemed worthy of investment and care, whereas others are not. And so with Sydney living in this community where she's been a resident for quite some time, during a time when it was predominantly Black and minority, having lived through the crack epidemic and those various periods where there wasn't a lot of investment being made into the community, where things that the community needed weren't being done, where residents would have to personally find a way to get things done because the government and other outside forces weren't going to help them or address or resolve those needs, right? She's aware of those times. But now with gentrification, in her case, you now have quite a number of white families, couples and whatnot moving into the neighborhood. And with that, she's noticing a dramatic change in things where you had these families that she'd known for decades, or even just individual residents, and suddenly every time you turn around, one of your neighbors is suddenly gone. There's someone new that just pops up living in their house. Someone just ups and purchases their property. And so seemingly overnight, the neighborhood is changing because the residents that had been living in these houses for years are now suddenly gone. And there's now just these random people moving in. And so throughout the book, what you have is there's this online forum where it kind of provides an opportunity for residents to communicate with each other. And so you kind of notice not so much a division, but rather that there's a drastic difference in perspective regarding things that take place within the community, between the old versus the new residents. It's like there's this one kid who, for all intents and purposes, sounds like a really great kid. Goes to school, doesn't get into any trouble, comes from a great family. And not to say that people like that never get into trouble or they don't have secrets, but suddenly there's this big supposed drug bust and his parents are forced to put up their house for collateral to try to get some legal assistance for him. And so this is something that's noticed with other people where, whether it's their house or business or something along those lines in the community, they suddenly find themselves either with tax issues or some other kind of legal problem, some kind of a difficult situation where seemingly the only solution that would allow them to get up this large amount of cash quickly to deal with whatever the problem might be is for them to sell their property. It's okay, it's one thing if it's one or two people, but then it starts to draw some attention, it's becoming more frequent, and it's happening to people that have shown no indication of, being operating on the wrong side of the law. These are people who've never been into any kind of trouble before. But suddenly, now you have it where it's they're being grabbed up by the police. And next thing you know, their house is being sold and some new resident is moving in. There's one longtime neighbor who supposedly goes on vacation to visit family in another state. And before you know it, when you're expecting for him to return home, here comes some new random neighbor moving in. And it's the speed and the frequency at which this is taking place, it draws attention. Sydney's motivated to start to put together a historic neighborhood tour, a walking tour, if you think of when you might go on vacation or go to visit a place. And so at the start of the book, she goes on a neighborhood tour with a different guide. And the guide takes them around the neighborhood, but the story that she's getting is really devoid of any information about the residents that live in the community, that have historically lived in the community. It's a very sanitized and whitewashed version of the neighborhood's history. And so taking issue with this and kind of pushing and prodding and asking questions, which is part of her personality, the guide, or I think one of the other tour goers, flippantly suggests that she should start her own tour. And so she does. She begins researching the neighborhood. One of the other guys on the tour, who's a new resident, his name is Theo. He's recently moved into the community with his girlfriend, and the two of them have gone on the tour, and he ends up introducing himself to Sydney and some of the other residents and whatnot during one of their community meetings, and volunteers to assist her with gathering information to put together this tour. So basically functioning as her research assistant. And so with that, they start digging into the history of the community and looking more closely into some of the things that have taken place in the community in the present with regard to the residents and real estate patterns, things like that. But one of the high points for me, and something that I like about these kinds of books, is I read a lot of nonfiction, but I balance it out with fiction as well. And sometimes I read things just to read it. I'm not looking for anything deeper or whatever. It's just an entertaining book that I'm looking to read. But I like fiction books. And I've been especially fortunate in recent years, because I've been reading a lot more through Noir Histoire, to come across these types of books where it's fiction, yes, but within that fictionalized story, there's some basis in reality. So for example, in this book, it's a fictionalized story about these characters living in this neighborhood in Brooklyn who are dealing with gentrification. And Sydney's amped up, and there's a little bit of, sci-fi kind of fiction, thriller type stuff. There's some far-fetched events in the book to take place as a means of adding drama and interest to the story. But what I really enjoyed was when Sydney begins working on research for this walking tour, she digs into the history of the neighborhood, but as part of that, they dig into the history of Brooklyn and large-scale story of housing and housing segregation, breaking down gentrification and real estate, and how, it was historically used as an economic driver. And as part of that, how access for Black people has been historically limited as a means of limiting the power and control, both politically and economically, of Black people. And so you end up getting this really entertaining story. But at the same time, every now and then the author actually drops a little bit of real knowledge, which I enjoyed. For example, she discusses this community within New York called Weeksville, which is at this point, I have it on my list to look into, but there's a historic Black community. By the time the book takes place, it no longer exists. But it played a very important and vital role in the larger Black community in New York. And so you have the story of how the community was broken up. But in telling that story, she doesn't call it out by name, but there's discussion of another community, the Black community that was destroyed to create Central Park, which would be Seneca Village, which I previously wrote about as a Black history short. And I enjoyed these little tidbits that she dropped throughout the book. This history of Black people in America and their history with housing and housing issues. This thing of eminent domain, where a number of neighborhoods throughout the South, Midwest, and things like that were quite often Black neighborhoods, such as Seneca Village, where there would be plans to develop either a highway, or in the case of Central Park, some other feature or resource facility or something like that. There would be plans to develop this new thing. And it would have to go somewhere. And quite often what would happen is that Black communities would be selected as the site to put highways through, or to raise these communities and put in place a park, where things like that wouldn't take place in white communities. White communities wouldn't be proposed as sites for the introduction of these government facilities or resources or what have you. But the Black communities would often be selected. And what that would mean in some places is running a highway through the middle of a community, through the middle of a Black downtown, thereby displacing a lot of the residents, kind of breaking up the sense of community. And so within this telling of the story, her touching on this reality of eminent domain and these revitalization plans that never really happened, it ended up being one of my favorite parts of the book, where you had this fictionalized story, but then also her dropping some real knowledge throughout the book. Not to say that you have to take it with a grain of salt, but rather that it's a jumping off point, because the book isn't about that specific topic, but rather just touches on it. So it's it's something where it would warrant and might be of interest, then dive into more deeply on your own to gain a more thorough understanding. I'd already researched, some of these topics, but now it had me wanting to look into Weeksville and other similar communities, some of the topics that she touched on. The book is really told from the perspective of the two characters. He's having some difficulties in his life. She's having some difficulties in hers. And they become not exactly friends, but they form a relationship of sorts in that they're working together. They're getting to know each other. The thing that I feel about these types of books is, the characters are Black. Yes. I think there's like an economic driver in making these types of books where the author or maybe the publisher, whoever it is, that while the characters are Black, there's intention for the book to appeal to a Black audience. There's also some hope that it will appeal to a wider audience as well, meaning white people. And in trying to appeal to a wider audience, I feel like what ends up happening is you then end up having like this random white character that's introduced. And that's not to say that Black and white people can't be friends or they can't be in a relationship, but the way the character tends to be introduced tends to give me pause. Because in the case of Theo, where you have these racial issues taking place with regards to housing, right? You get the sense, kind of this feel where he's put in to counterbalance some of the wrongdoing on the part of the newly arrived residents, the white characters, where it's like he kind of feels like he's there to be the good white guy, where it's like you have these other white characters who are just out here carrying on crazy and running amok. And he's put in to be like the white character to balance that out. Have this thing going in the background of, well, not all white people are like that. And certainly we know that, right? That we know that's the case, right? But the way that it's carried out, it just feels like his presence just feels a bit obvious and heavy-handed, where it's like he's just like too perfect. And it came across to me as like kind of pandering, right? Like he's put in place to help the book appeal to white people. So it's like you're a white person picking up this book where for the most part, the white characters are carrying on, they're behaving badly, and it might be uncomfortable for you to read. Obviously, this book isn't about you. So, unless you're out here gentrifying neighborhoods, you probably shouldn't feel badly. You could probably ask yourself some questions and maybe have discussions with friends and family, but it's not like a personal attack on you. But I find that sometimes with like books of this nature, maybe even movies, there'll be a predominantly Black cast. And then there's like this one random white person who's meant to serve as like the stand-in for white people. In this case, here you have this one white character. And there's like some other white characters as well, but they're like the bad guys because they're the ones gentrifying the neighborhood. But then you have like this one random white guy who's just like the perfect guy. It honestly becomes a little bit ridiculous. If it felt more like natural and authentic, I wouldn't have an issue with his presence. But Theo, I just wasn't digging him. Honestly, I wasn't really digging Sydney either. She's like a flawed person and whatnot. Not to say the characters have to be perfect, but I felt like the characters needed work. Because Sydney's the main character, but it felt a bit like I've read this character before, and it's kind of tired. The story felt new and different until it kind of got into some tinfoil hat territory later on in the book. But I felt the characters overall needed more work. The basic idea of the story, the gist of the story worked for me. But Sydney, her best friend, Theo, the characters and the dialogue just felt a little bit off for me, and it was like, I'm not really buying these people. The story of the neighborhood that's being gentrified, like, it gets into like crazy territory. But the story of this neighborhood being gentrified resonated with me. That was cool. But I felt the way some of the characters were written was just like, this needs a little bit more work. They didn't feel complex enough for me. The author introduced some flaws for Sydney in an attempt to make her feel more complex and human. But I still felt like I've read books with this character before, and a lot of the supporting characters were pretty much forgettable. They just ran together for me, so the book really shines with regards to story, the overarching story of this neighborhood, but I didn't really like the way many of the characters were written. I felt like they were cliches. Like, I've read this already with regards to like the characters and how they're portrayed. And, I know the author, I believe, typically writes romance, and that's not really my thing. There's a little bit of that here. I don't mind books where, characters are in love, but from the outset, like, it felt too obvious for me. I could tell where things were headed between these two, and it would be a completely different story, but I would have preferred if the book was just about this neighborhood being gentrified. Because, like, Sydney and Theo as individuals weren't that interesting to me. And so, like, they were, like, boring on their own. And they were just as uninteresting together. So that was, like, my major issue with the book. So, story is really cool. The brewing romance that's obvious from the outset is going to happen. It was like, nah, I'm not really here for it. I'm not really buying it. But yet still, with all of that, I think the overarching story is good enough where it's still a book that's worth checking out. The perspective on gentrification is really, really interesting, especially the little tidbits of history that you get throughout. And so with that, it's not a perfect book, but I think it's still a cool read, especially if you're looking for something a little bit lighter and really entertaining for the summer. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes are available on the Noir Histoire website via the link in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode and want more book recommendations, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my book review playlist.